Hi everybody and welcome to Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans, True Aussie Murders Caffeinated. I am your host, Belinda Brady, and welcome. Welcome guys to episode 14 titled The Mutilator. Now, I will say straight up, if you hear little noises in the background, my supervisors / executive producers, Kona and Milo, my little dash hounds, are in the studio with me. So if you do hear puppy noises, that is them. You're not hearing things. Okay, so as I've said, episode 14, The Mutilator. Straight off the bat, sources is murdersmostfoul.com, thedailytelegraph.com.au, murderpedia.org, and crimelibrary.org. Now, I will say this straight off the bat as well. This one is very graphic. It does go into mutilation and murder. And if that is something you can't stomach or you don't want to listen to, that is fine. You don't have to. You can turn me off. You can go listen to somebody else. I will not be offended. I promise you. I am not your girl, and that is okay. But if you are interested in this crime, and it is a hell of a crime, a hell of a killing spree, then please lend me your ears. Now, straight up, I'm drinking a coffee. Yes, it's still hot. It's still humid. It's still disgustingly hot summer here in Australia, but I am having a black coffee with s'mores syrup because I need the caffeine. So I need something that Coke just can't seem to give me at the moment. So hopefully you guys have your drinks. You've got yourself comfies, you've got yourself cool, you've got yourself warm, you've got yourself caffeinated. And let's go. Let's get started. Let's get stuck right into episode 14, The Mutilator. Now, serial killers come in all shapes and forms and sexes. Now, I think it would be fair to say that the most famous murders, the most famous serial killers are the ones that have killed women. I mean, we can think about, when we think about serial killers who have targeted women, we can think of quite a few off the top of our head. But there are also serial killers that target men and men only, and often it is for their own their own sick self-gratification or their own denial about their own sexuality. And once caught, some of these killers actually tell us why they killed. They go into great detail, giving us tales of trauma and neglect or abuse and harm, things that our minds accept, if only for a minute, that could be the possible reason for a person turning into a serial killer. And it would also help us justify that, I guess, not all killers are born this way. And then there are some killers who kill and kill in such a gruesome, barbaric way that we think there has to be a reason for it. There has to be some kind of assault or trauma or abuse that made them act out this way. But sometimes there's just not. And the killer never tells us if there was any underlying trauma or reason, and that he killed with such brutality and ferociousness that once arrested and jailed, when offered the possibility of possibly having parole, he refused because he said the urges to kill never really went away, and if given the chance, he'd kill many more. And this leads us to the story of serial killer William McDonald, the man who killed 5 young men, 1 in Brisbane and 4 in Sydney and surrounding suburbs in 1962. The one the media dubbed the Mutilator, named for his fondness of removing the genitals of his victims, and the one who at one point was also dubbed the Walking Corpse because he was buried. He was dead and buried, and then he bumped into a co-worker who said the exact same thing: you're meant to be dead. Some murders and some killers are so bizarre yet so downright scary, they don't leave you once you've learned about them. The stories don't leave you. And I admit I'd never heard of this case until I was researching it for this episode, and it is one of the more disturbing and brutal cases I have covered. He killed his victims with such brutality and such excessive force. If there was an underlying reason for it, that he attacked his male victims with such ferociousness, I don't think he's ever admitted as to why, and he's certainly never been on the record as to saying why. So settle in, guys, and lend me your ears as I take you back to Sydney, New South Wales, Australia, 1962, and we take a deep, disturbing dive into the serial killer William McDonald, also known as the Mutilator. This episode's case starts in the Queensland suburb of Brisbane and ends in Sydney, New South Wales, with the murders happening in suburbs in between, such as Woolloomooloo and Darlinghurst. Now, these suburbs, Sydney and surrounding suburbs, and the ones I've mentioned, are full of bars and breweries and shops and cafes, and it is full of folks from all walks of life who call these suburbs their home. Now, housing prices and rents are ridiculously expensive due to its proximity to Sydney, and it is a really well sought after area. Now, it wasn't always this way. In the 20s, the area had a bad rep due to the violence that the razor gangs brought to the area, and its residents were a mix of rich and poor. But by the 60s, the area was on the rise thanks to an influx of migrants who brought stability and new cultures to experience with them. You know, new food, new cultures, a new way of living. And by the 60s, the area was attracting all kinds to the area, from the art community to the gay community. It was, though, still an area where those who enjoyed the seedier things in life or those who loved to party could, thanks to its many bars, and they could do it easily. You know, bars were everywhere. You know, stone's throw, you could throw a stone to find a bar. And also its close proximity to the party capital of Sydney at the time, which was King's Cross. Now, King's Cross is a whole different area. It is, you can go there and party, you can go there and experience the seedier things in life, and it really does have that undercurrent of crime and corruption, but we're not going to go into that. So the area also housed a lot of homeless and derelict men. Now, before we talk about the murder that took place in Queensland, we need to go to the second victim and the others first. Now, I know this is a weird order, but I promise you, once you hear the whole story, it will make perfect sense why I have done it this way. So we'll go to the second murder. So it was a cold June morning, June 4th, 1961. Now, our winter is in June, July and August. So for those of you who enjoy summer at that time of year. So it was a cold June morning, 4th of June 1961, and the police were called to the Sydney Domain Baths. Now, the Sydney Domain Baths are a secluded free public baths built in 1858 as a public health measure for folks to swim and bathe in due to indoor plumbing not being invented yet. But in the 60s, it was a popular swimming spot because it was secluded from prying eyes, and it was also where a lot of homeless people hung out because they could actually shelter in the little caves around the area and escape the winter chill. Now, a nude body was found there. And the nude body was a male, and he had been stabbed over 30 times and had his genitalia completely severed from his body. I'm talking his penis and his testicles completely cut away from his body. Now, the man was identified as 41-year-old Alfred Greenfield, a homeless, unemployed blacksmith, and he had been stabbed with such ferocity the arteries in his neck were severed. His penis and testicles had been removed at the scrotum and were nowhere to be found. They weren't at the crime scene. Now, they were later found by police in Sydney Harbour. Whoever had removed them had thrown them into Sydney Harbour. Now, the police were at a loss at the unusual yet brutal crime before them, and the killer was dubbed the Mutilator by the press, with talk of the crime being some kind of crime of passion or a homosexual crime. And with no real leads, the government offered a reward of £1,000 for any info that led to the killer, but there were no leads to be found. And after extensive investigations, the police had nothing. No leads, no suspects, no hot tips, nothing. It wouldn't be long, though, before the killer struck again and gave them more to think about. Not long after this, on or around the 21st of November 1961, the body of 37-year-old Ernest Cobbin, now Ernest was estimated to be around 37 years old, was found dead in a public toilet in the Moore Park with multiple stab wounds. And like Alfred before him, his genitals had been completely removed. Now, police had absolutely no idea who the killer or what his or her motive was. They had no clue. They were at an absolute loss. They were offering rewards. They were offering, come and tell us who you think it is. At one point, they were looking for what they thought was a deranged doctor because of the skill that the genitals were removed with, but they had absolutely nothing. The killer, meanwhile, had a bit of a rest before striking again on the 31st of March 1962, and the victim was Frank Gladstone McLean. Now, I wasn't able to find an age for Frank, and in a sick twist of fate, he was almost rescued, and then he wasn't. Frank was in Darlinghurst in Burke Lane with his killer when the assault on him started, and it was interrupted by a family going for a night walk. So the killer and Frank were in a lane, and the street that was horizontal to it, a family was walking past it. This disturbed the killer. The killer stopped, went and hid in the shadows so he would not be seen. Now, Frank was too drunk, too injured to call out for help, so he was just on the ground semi-conscious. And if the family did see him, they probably just would have thought he was another drunk sleeping one off. Once the family passed, the killer dragged Frank further into the lane, into the shadows and out of sight, and finished the job. And again, after stabbing him repeatedly, he cut off his genitals, just like the others. Now, at this stage, police were really concerned about the genitals being cut off, as well as the murders, but they'd never come across anything like it. And like I touched on before, they were thinking they were looking at maybe a deranged doctor who was the killer who had been doing this. So they were investigating doctors in the area. But again, that turned up nothing. They had a task force set up. Clairvoyants were even consulted. Huge rewards were offered, up to £10,000. And at that time, that was a huge amount of money. Like, it's a huge amount of money now. But back then, that was, we can buy a house and set ourselves up kind of money. But they were still absolutely no closer to figure out who the killer was. Now, the Mutilator struck again on the 6th of June 1962, and the poor victim was a fresh out of prison derelict and thief by the name of Patrick Hackett. Now, Patrick was a 37-year-old man and had been drinking in a wine saloon in Pitt Street, Sydney, when he was seen leaving with another man. He was never seen again until his body was found underneath an abandoned delicatessen/shop after neighbours complained of a putrid odour coming from the building, like a putrid odour coming from the building. Now, when police broke into that building, they found the nude body of Patrick, and he was so badly decomposed that they had to do an autopsy outside of the hospital to keep the smell out. Now, they could only determine at that stage that the man was in his 40s and had died from multiple stab wounds. Police also quickly assumed the body was that of the delicatessen store owner, Alan Brennan, who had not been seen for a few weeks. A notice of his death was put in the paper, and a small memorial service was held, which was attended to by some of this man's previous workmates. So to give you a bit of context, Alan had worked for the post office, but then he lost his job, and that's when he bought the delicatessen/shop. So when his previous co-workers saw the notice of his death in the paper, they were like, oh my God, Alan's dead, we have to go in and pay our respects. So they attended the memorial. Now, this is where things get really interesting. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, the case of the walking corpse comes into it. Now, the man who owned the delicatessen, the man who authorities assumed had been horribly murdered, and the man friends and workmates knew as Alan Brennan, the same Alan whose memorial service they attended, bumped into one of his ex-work colleagues, a man by the name of John McCarthy, who had attended his memorial and also had delivered a memorial wreath to his grave. Now, you can imagine the shock John experienced at seeing his dead workmate standing before him, living and breathing, right before his eyes, but only several months beforehand, he was at his memorial and laying flowers on his grave. You know, anyone would be like, oh my God, you're meant to be dead. But it happened. And on an April afternoon in 1963 is when this happened. And John bumped into his very much alive friend in Sydney's town hall. He exclaimed, he was shocked and actually screamed, oh my God, Brennan, I believed you were dead. Now, a startled Brennan replied, leave me alone, and made his escape into the crowd, quickly losing his ex-worker colleague. Now, shaken and undeterred, John reported the incident to the police, who dismissed it. And I guess, you wouldn't really believe it, I guess. I mean, I can't say I blame them. And sent him on his way. They've said, you've had too much to drink, go sleep it off. But it wasn't the case. So frustrated, John went to the press, where the story landed on the desk of an interested journalist. And if I was that journo, hell yeah, I'd be taking that story on, who ran the story under the headline of The Case of the Walking Corpse. And the publicity and the scrutiny the police force were exposed to following this article forced the police to exhume the body of Alan, and upon more thorough inspection, they discovered that the fingerprints of the corpse were not that of Alan Brennan, but they belonged to a man called Patrick Hackett. And they also discovered that Patrick's genitals had been hacked at, not removed, but hacked at. Now, an identikit of the man who called himself Alan Brennan was put together and sent to every press agency in the country. In turn, it was put on the front page of every paper in the country, and in turn, in Melbourne, Victoria, a different state to New South Wales, a different state altogether, employees saw the picture and very quickly figured out the man police wanted was their workmate, who went by the name of William MacDonald. Sure, he dyed his hair and he'd grown a moustache, but it was definitely him. Police were called, and William was arrested when he went in to collect his pay. Now, police were expecting William to deny any knowledge of the murders, and they thought they had a job ahead of them getting a confession out of him. But to their surprise, William confessed to all 4 murders and one in Brisbane, Queensland. And the details were absolutely horrific, as we would expect. But first, before I go into that, let's take a look at the mutilator, a man called William MacDonald. William MacDonald, also known as Allen Ginsberg, was born on the 17th of June 1924 to a wealthy family in Liverpool, England, and he was the second of 3 siblings. He was an introvert who was quiet and kept to himself and was neglected by his socialite parents. They weren't really interested in him. So he joined the British Army at age 19, and at age 19 he was raped by one of his corporals, a man by the name of Alexander Rice. Traumatised by the experience, he was discharged in 1947, and at some stage he was diagnosed as being schizophrenic, and he was institutionalised and treated with the controversial ECT shock therapy. When he was released, he was arrested for propositioning a police officer in a public toilet. Now, when his parents got word of this, and there was even a whiff of their son being gay, they shamed him, telling him he brought embarrassment to the family name. Now, this motivated William to change his name to William MacDonald, and moved to Australia, and that's what he did. He arrived here in Brisbane, Queensland in 1955. Now, William always had an interest in the macabre and idolised London serial killer Jack the Ripper. Now, tormented by the voices in his head, he moved around the country a lot, not really being able to settle down. He moved around, and by 1961 he wound up in Brisbane, Queensland, where the urge to kill was overwhelming, and he went on and chose his first victim number 1. Now, the one I mentioned at the very beginning of this episode. And this man was 55-year-old Amos Hurst, a man he befriended, and after a long day of drinking at a nearby pub, William persuaded Amos to let him accompany him back to his hotel room. There the two continued drinking until William put his hand around the drunk Amos's throat and started to strangle him. Amos would have been too drunk to fight back, and even if he could fight back, his efforts would have been fruitless. He was strangled to death, stripped naked, and left in his bed. Covered in blood, his face was covered in blood from where he had been punched and hemorrhaged during his violent death. William washed himself up and went home. So he put Amos in bed, tucked him in bed neatly, still covered in blood, washed himself up and went home. Terrified the police would come knocking at any minute, William searched the papers every day until he finally saw his victim's name in the death notices of the paper. It also stated the cause of death, which they did back then. And the cause of death was stated as a sudden heart attack. The bruises around his neck were put down to a drunken fight. William could not believe his luck. He had gotten away with murder. He had literally gotten away with murder. William then relocated to Sydney, New South Wales in January 1961, and it wasn't long before his urges to kill started up again. Now, I will now go through the happenings of each murder as according to William, starting with his first victim in Sydney, New South Wales, Alfred Greenfield, on the 4th of June 1961. Now, William struck up a conversation with Alfred on a park bench opposite St Vincent's Hospital in Darlinghurst. The men chatted, and William told the drunk Alfred he had more bottles of booze in his bag and they should move to the Domain baths where they could keep on drinking. Alfred agreed, and the pair found a secluded corner of the baths, and they drank until Alfred fell asleep. William then put on a raincoat, took out his knife and plunged it into the sleeping man over and over with such ferocity the knife severed arteries in his neck. Once dead, William sliced off Alfred's penis and testicles and threw them into the Sydney Harbour as he was walking home, stopping along the way to wash the blood from his face and hands. Moving on to Ernest Coburn, who was murdered on or around the 21st of November 1961. William was walking down South Dowling Street, East Sydney, when a drunk Ernest was seen staggering towards him. Now, taking advantage of the situation that had presented itself to him, William lured Ernest to nearby Moore Park, and the two went into the public toilet and drank beer together. William put his raincoat on and took out his knife and stabbed Ernest under the throat, severing his jugular vein while he was still sitting on the toilet seat. Now, William stabbed him with a motion that was like a boxer delivering an uppercut. So rather than punching Ernest in the throat, he's delivered a punch but with a knife, if that makes sense. So the stabbing motion was like a boxer delivering an uppercut. And as a result of this, blood sprayed all over the walls in the toilet cubicle. At one point, Ernest tried to defend himself and put his arms up, but drunk and bleeding to death from such a savage blow to his neck, he never ever stood a chance. William stabbed him all over the face, chest, head, neck and arms, and once Ernest was dead and had fallen off the toilet seat in a bloodied heap, William took his pants down and cut off his penis and testicles, wrapped them up in a plastic bag, where once home he kept them in bed with him for the night before tying them and the murder weapon to a brick and tossing them into the Sydney Harbour. Murder victim Frank McLean, who was murdered on the 31st of March 1962. William bumped into Frank as he was walking down Burke Street, and William was walking around looking for his next victim. He was all ready to go. He had his raincoat and he had a new knife. He was looking for somebody when he bumped into Frank. Now, the two had a little convo, and William suggested they have a drink in Burke Lane, out of sight of locals and the police, where they could enjoy a beer and a chat and not be disturbed. Frank agreed. And as they rounded a corner, William plunged his knife into Frank's throat. Frank put up a fight, and if he wasn't drunk, he would have taken William because he was a lot taller and a lot bigger. But he was drunk, and he was no match for William's determination to kill him. And he fell backwards onto the ground from the blows that William was delivering to him. Now, a family walking past the top of the laneway interrupted this, forcing William to hide in the shadows. And if they did see Frank's body on the ground, they just would have assumed he was a drunk sleeping one off. Once the family had passed by, William continued his stabbing frenzy, and once he was certain Frank was really truly dead, cut off his genitals and took them home with him. Again, kept them in bed with him overnight, and the next day he threw them into Sydney Harbour. On victim Patrick Hackett, who was murdered on or around the 21st of November 1962, using the alias Alan Brennan, he paid £560 for a mixed business shop / delicatessen in Burwood, an inner west suburb of Sydney. He sold sandwiches and small goods, and by all reports he enjoyed his job and he enjoyed being his own boss. That is, until the urges to kill became overwhelming. And by November 1962, he took himself to a place called the Wine Saloon, where he befriended fresh out of jail 37-year-old Patrick Hackett. The two men shared drinks and conversation, and before long, William invited Patrick back to his place of business, where the pair could continue drinking. The pair were dropped off to the shop by a taxi, where they continued drinking until Patrick passed out. Seizing the moment to kill again, William lunged the knife into a sleeping Patrick's throat, but to William's surprise, Patrick woke up and defended himself, actually pushing the knife back, which pushed back into William's hand, severely cutting it. Injured but undeterred, Patrick was no match for an enraged William, who stabbed Patrick straight through the heart, killing him instantly. And even if he wasn't dead, he soon was dead, because William kept on stabbing and stabbing and stabbing until he was exhausted and lay next to the body of Patrick, panting and struggling for breath, covered in blood. Blood was all over the shop. It was all over the floor and the ceiling and the walls. Now, William bandaged his cut hand with a dishcloth and, undeterred, tried to cut Patrick's genitals off, but the knife was blunt. So all he could do was stab at the penis and testicles a few times. He couldn't make the cut to get them off. He fell asleep where he sat, and the next morning, he woke up covered in dry blood. Patrick still dead beside him, the place still covered in blood. He had a bath, went to the hospital where he got his hand stitched up, and returned to his shop and cleaned up the blood, having to rip up and throw away most of the floor lino because he couldn't get the blood off. It took him pretty much all day to clean up the shop. He stripped Patrick naked and dragged him underneath his shop, where he left him there to decompose. Panicked, the police would come looking for Patrick because William and Patrick were dropped at William's shop, William's place of business, by a taxi driver, so William was the last person seen with Patrick. William shut up shop literally and skipped town for Queensland and left Patrick's body to rot underneath the store where he had left him. Not long after, William left Queensland for New Zealand, but then returned to Sydney, New South Wales, where he bumped into his shocked ex-co-worker in Pitt Street, who had exclaimed, "You're supposed to be dead." While he was in New Zealand, this is when the body was discovered in his shop, and everyone had assumed that it was William / Alan who was dead. It was then William realised that people thought it was him they found in his shop, not the body of Patrick. And he knew people would be asking questions, so panicked again. He grabbed his belongings and hightailed it to Victoria, where he took a job with Melbourne Railways. Now, this is the job where his co-workers, after an identikit picture was published in every paper in the country, co-workers recognised him as the most wanted man in the country and dobbed him in. William didn't resist when he was arrested upon collecting his pay, and he didn't oppose his extradition to Sydney, New South Wales, where he was charged with 4 counts of murder. I couldn't see if he was charged with a murder in Brisbane, Queensland. I'm going to assume he wasn't, because he was tried and convicted in New South Wales for the crimes he committed there. Now, a crowd was waiting for the man who brought a city and a police force to its knees. And when he arrived, they were shocked to see the monster they were expecting was, in fact, a thin, short, meek, unimpressive man. You wouldn't look at him and think he was capable of doing what he had done. William pleaded guilty to all 4 counts of murder on the grounds of insanity, and his trial was held in September 1963, where the public were a captive audience. The gallery listened in shock as William went into great detail about each murder he committed, with several in the gallery fainting as he described his stabbing frenzies and how he removed his victims' genitals. He was found guilty of each count of murder, and the plea of insanity was rejected. Now, before sentencing him to life in prison, Justice McClellan said it was the most barbaric murder case, and one where the perpetrator had total disregard for human life, that he had ever presided over. William showed no signs of remorse, and his file was marked likely to reoffend. And it wasn't long before William nearly proved that right, as he beat a fellow prisoner, within inches of his life with a slops bucket in Long Bay Jail, and after that he was declared insane and moved to Morisset Psychiatric Centre for the Criminally Insane. Now, Morisset is in New South Wales, and he was there for 16 years. In 1980, he was declared sane enough to go back to mainstream prison and was sent to protective custody in Cessnock Prison in New South Wales, which is not too far from Morisset, where he was in the psychiatric centre. There, he listened to classical music and read books and was known as Old Bill. In December 2000, he declined attending a court hearing where a possible parole date would be set for him, with him saying, quote, "I am institutionalised now. I have no desire to go and live on the outside. I wouldn't last 5 minutes. I am too old, and besides, I have everything I could ever want where I am." Now, William did enjoy the odd day trip. He was taken out on the odd day trip to see the outside world, but repeatedly expressed no desire to be back in the outside world or amongst the community. Now, ironically enough, when questioned about this by an author who was writing a story about him, he said, quote, "It's terrible out there. People aren't even safe in their own homes." Now, on a side note, if you are interested in the book or the story I have just mentioned, it is called Australia's Serial Killers, The Definitive History of Serial Multicide in Australia by Paul B. Kidd. Now, the author, Paul Kidd, was given access to William in jail and actually befriended him. Now, the bits I have read are fascinating, and I highly recommend checking this book out if this case has grabbed you, and it does give you a bit of an insight into William, and it's a bit of a fascinating read, so I highly recommend it if this case has grabbed you. Now, William MacDonald, the Mutilator, died from a gastrointestinal blockage on the 12th of May 2015 while still imprisoned. He was the longest serving prisoner in custody in New South Wales. He took his secrets, he took his reasons with him to the grave, and no one really knows why he did what he did. He has claimed that he was schizophrenic. He has claimed that when he was murdering people, it was another William that was acting out and killing these defenceless men. We don't know. Was he born that way? Was his alleged rape as a young man, was that a cause? Was that the trauma? Is that why he kept cutting off all their genitals? Or Was he a closet gay? And he had problems with that because his family shunned him for that very reason. We will never know. And the only person who does know that is William, and he has passed away, taking that with him to the grave. So there we have it, guys. The fascinating and brutal and just sad case of William MacDonald, the mutilator, the man who, for whatever reasons only known to him, decided to kill and mutilate men, I guess for his own sick self-gratification. That's the only conclusion I can really come to. And that's it, guys. Another episode of Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans, True Aussie Murders, caffeinated, done and dusted. If you are enjoying my podcast, if you are enjoying these episodes, please get the word out there. This is a call out, shout out, tell everybody, tell your friends, tell your co-workers, tell your garbage man, tell everybody. I've also got on my podcast, you can send me a text, you can send me some fan mail, and if you have any cases that you think I should look at, if you'd love to hear covered in this podcast, please let me know. I'm all ears. I'm always looking for something to investigate and to research, and something that I have not heard about before is always great, as was the case with the mutilator. Had not heard about it until I started researching it. And as always, guys, you can find me on TikTok too. I have finally joined the rest of the world and signed up with TikTok. So if you are on there, please give me a follow. I'd love to see you. I'd love to interact with you. And as always, guys, thank you for lending me your ears. And until next time, stay safe, stay cool, and stay caffeinated. I will catch you all later.